I'm Grant Charles. I'm an associate professor in social work at UBC and a visiting scholar to the representative's office, and I'm the moderator for tonight. The format is there's going to be a couple of short talks, and then Mike Degagne will speak for roughly half an hour, and then Mary-Ellen Turpel-Lafont for another half hour, and then there'll be a question discussion period after that. Just to let people know, the washrooms are just back at the end of this floor if you need them. And also at the back on a table for when you leave are some books from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. When the Harper government cut the funding for the foundation, they were in the midst of publishing a number of books of accounts by survivors, residential school survivors, and other people about a variety of different topics. So what we have at the back table are the last of these books, the most recent copy. There's another one coming out on issues about law in a few months, but this is the last of kind of the general purpose one. So please help yourself to one when you leave. What else can I say? I just want to give a quick little thing about Mike and Mary-Ellen, who I've had the privilege of working with both of them for a number of years. And I just wanted to say between them, they have 16 degrees, which sounds impressive until you realize none of them are from UBC, so, you know. Yeah. Anyhow, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Archibald, who's Associate Dean of Indigenous Education and full professor in the Faculty of Education.
Well, good evening. It is my pleasure to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded land of the Musqueam First Nation. And Musqueam means people of the river grass. And why we say unceded is that Musqueam never gave up the lands that UBC is situated on. And so I think what we've done is start to acknowledge, and this evening I'll give a brief introduction to some of the research that is happening within the Faculty of Education. And I wanted to use a research project that we're undertaking with the Musqueam community as an example of how I think it's our responsibility as a university to ensure that we are addressing, Indigenous peoples, especially those whose lands that we benefit from and learn from over the years. And I'll only be very brief in my remarks. But the research project I want to share with you, the story of tonight, I think represents what we are aspiring to do as far as ensuring that our research is respectful, relevant, and meaningful to Indigenous communities, and also focusing a lot on children and children's families. So this research project is called Awakening the Spirit, and it's about revitalizing canoeing at Musqueam. And you might think, canoeing, how is that credible research? And how does that relate to education? Well, we have a wonderful cooperation amongst different faculties. Our lead is Shelley Johnson from the School of Social Work here at UBC, and myself and Faculty of Education, and we work along with Andrea Lyle from the Faculty of Forestry. So we have these three faculties, but the most important part is that Musqueam community is the partner in this research. They're the ones who determined, this particular project because they felt that they wanted to have something positive in their community for the young people, for the youth. And they recalled that with the canoeing was a very important part of the community lifestyle for many years. And it was a holistic approach where those who were involved in canoeing would be very healthy physically. They pay attention to nutrition. It was a way to build family and community cohesiveness, and also have fun and learn about the environment at the same time. But I think due to impacts of colonization and many other things that happened with that over the years, that sort of went away. But now the community decided it's time to revitalize it. So we were responsive from the university to undertake this research project. We got some huge funds from our federal granting agency, Social Science Humanities Research Council. So this project is community initiated, has community partnership. The community benefits in a number of ways from this project, and we're working along with different community members to be involved in the research. And at the same time, they're revitalizing traditional knowledge that relates to making a big canoe out of a big tree, and then teaching that to some of the young children and various ages. And so the hope is to revitalize that canoeing project. So in this example, then we are building on Indigenous knowledge, Musqueam knowledge. We have elders from the community who are sharing some of their stories, very much story-based. They talk about the values, and from there we can identify those, and find ways that we can implement those through some of the research and the educational programs that the youth will be involved in. And that this important notion of partnership is there, that it's driven by the community. So this is an example of the type of research that we're trying to emphasize within our Faculty of Education, that we reach out, involve others, that we're very much based in community, that we build on Indigenous knowledge, so that the research itself, the outcomes, the benefits will be realized in educational materials, in a way of reawakening, revitalizing important values, the Musqueam language, ensuring that we have intergenerational learning. So all those important approaches, that have made our families and communities strong in the past will be part of this project. And that we are involving some of the students, the university students will be able to take courses in relation to this project at the undergraduate and a graduate level. So we're trying to show the link between research and education, that they should be very much influenced by each other. So I just wanted to use that short little story about this research project with Musqueam to exemplify, what's important as far as Indigenous research for us within the Faculty of Education. So I'll just leave it there for you to know that that exists, and that there are important principles that I've identified that I hope that we'll continue to think about. And if you want to know more about this project, just contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I get to listen to Shelley talk about that because our offices are beside each other, and I don't think I've ever been so jealous of another colleague about getting to work on that project. But I didn't say that out loud because, that's not what we do in academia. I'd like to introduce now Jerry Nasbaum, who's the president of the Rorschach Association of Canada. He's going to do a few words.
Thank you and good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to greet you today at the fourth lecture in the How to Love a Child, the Janusz Korczak lecture series entitled The Human Rights of Indigenous Children. My name is Jerry Nasbaum, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to you on behalf of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada. I'm happy to host member of the BC Legislative Assembly, Mr. George Heyman. Welcome. I would like to welcome Dr. Joanne Archibald, and Associate Dean for Indigenous Education, and thank you very much for your introduction. I'm still looking for Joanne. And warm welcome to our keynote speakers, Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, a British Columbia representative for children and youth, and Dr. Mike DeGagne, President and Vice Chancellor of Nipissing University. A special welcome to Professor James Anglin from the University of Victoria. At the first lecture of the series, we've heard, and I paraphrase, no, there's no legislation to prescribe love. But yes, there's a way to legislate a law that facilitates an environment for love and respect, better health, nutrition, education, and elevate and makes children's voice more prominent. What would it take to facilitate this environment? Here are a few of the rights I wanted to share with you, rights that Korczak mentioned in his writing. The child has the right to love. And Korczak wrote, children offered care and love will reciprocate with love and care. Once more, children offered care and love will reciprocate with love and care. The child has the right to respect, has the right to live in present. As Korczak would say, children are not people of tomorrow, they are people right today. Child has the right to be taken seriously. The child has the right to be appreciated for what he is. The child has the right to education. The child has the right to protest an injustice. In simple words, Korczak would say, we must end despotism. The child has the right to be heard and not to be afraid to voice their opinion. And here again, Korczak, there are many terrible things in the world, but the worst is when a child is afraid of his father, mother, or teacher. Dr. Korczak believed that this right should be universal and irrespective of religion, culture, or place of origin. He believed that children brought up in a healthy and happy environment become happy, productive, and creative adults. He would also say health of the society or the country can be gauged by the well-being of its children. But Korczak also put his philosophy into practice directly. He dedicated his life to transforming the universal into particular for many years in his orphanages that were organized as a children's republic, the most democratic children's society. The Children's Republic had a democratic structure and spirit and valued the child's right to speak and to be heard. The Children's Republic offered children a voice in their society and self-government. Critically for Korczak, children's rights came hand in hand with responsibilities. Part of respecting children for him was to not overprotect them and to make them an integral part of the way their world functioned, purposefully and actively engaging in their environment rather than being passive bystanders and passive recipients of adults' experiences. Korczak's orphanages are a world away from the problems facing our children today, but his philosophy remains relevant to this day. One lesson that we strive to take in today's lecture is the value of having both a commitment to the principle of children's rights, as well as a commitment to turning our principles into practice on a local level. It was Warsaw, Poland, the year it's 1912, where Korczak Orphanage was established. It wouldn't have happened without the vision and philanthropy of main supporters of the project, Dr. Isaac and his wife Stella Eliasberg. Incidentally, we are hosting today a grandson of the Eliasbergs, the MLA George Heyman. What a connection. The purpose of this lecture series is to facilitate a dialogue among people representing different professions, different walks of life involved in caring for children, their welfare, and their well-being. It is an interdisciplinary dialogue, a multifaceted picture, and in today's lecture we are going to examine the field of children's rights. Our speakers will put these ideas into the context of the human rights, children's rights, the rights of the indigenous children. Who was Korczak, and what is the connection between Korczak and the Charter of Children's Rights? How relevant is Korczak for our today's dialogue? Korczak was a pioneer spokesman, advocate, and interpreter of children's rights. Dr. Korczak's writing and his philosophy were inspiration and laid a foundation for the Convention on the Rights of Child, rights that need to be respected and protected. Korczak not only formulated children's rights, but for 30 years put them into practice at the orphanage. In his honor, our organization has established a scholarship. Janusz Korczak, Association of Canada Graduate Scholarship in Children's Rights and Canadian Indigenous Education, granted annually by the Faculty of Education at UBC. I would like to thank our co-organizers, the Faculty of Education, also the Edwina and Paul Heller Memorial Fund, the Vancouver Foundation, the Consulate of the Republic of Poland, the Department of Pediatrics, the School of Social Work, BC Representative for Children and Youth, the Ontario Advocate for Children and Youth, and we are delighted that we now got on board also support from UNICEF. Special thanks to the steering committee members. Our organization, the Korczak Association of Canada, is a charity, and if you would like to make a donation to the organization or directly to the scholarship fund, please pick up one of the forms on your way out or visit the association website provided in programs that you received. If you would like to join our association, see the brochure or our website. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike Degagne. Mike is the president and vice chancellor of Nipissing University in North Bay, Ontario. Prior to that, he was the founding and only executive director for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was an organization set up in the late 90s to provide funding and support to Indigenous communities in terms of capacity building and healing from the residential school legacy. Mike's not only an educator, but has also been a senior federal civil service. He's been the board chair for the Canadian Child Welfare League. He sat on the Mental Health Commission of Canada, numerous other things he's done. He's recently received the Order of Canada, which is magnificent, I think, and well-deserved. So I'd like to introduce Mike Degagne.
Very much. Thank you for that introduction. A very curious thing happens to me when I speak to groups about this size is that when I look at your faces, you all look like somebody I know. And it's the funniest thing. It's as if all of a sudden I'm in a room full of friends, and I hope it sounds that way, at least through my voice. But I do have friends here and people that I know, and I'm grateful for them to have come and to listen. They've heard me say this stuff before, and it's nice to have you come and hear it again. Thank you, the Korczak Foundation. Thank you very much. What a wonderful honor it is to speak in the reflected glow of a wonderful man and a wonderful causes and principles for which he fought. Also to the UBC, always glad to be here. You can imagine, as a person from a small Northern Ontario university of 5,000 people, how jealous I am of facilities like this. We need to project a little more. I don't get that often, but I will. We're here tonight to talk about children's rights, and I love that phrase you use, the idea that children's rights exist, and we also have to talk about how those rights manifest themselves, how they get turned into action. So I say, I bring my experience here, my experience as a person who worked for the last 20 years in the residential school area. I bring my ideas about rights and about Indigenous rights, especially Indigenous children's rights. I color it with the history of residential schools. Aboriginal children have rights in this province. They have them in this country. Those rights are existent. How they are implemented, how they are acknowledged, how systems treat those rights is what it is that we're here to talk about. My good friend, Gail Guthrie-Velasquez, who was the first Aboriginal woman to be the dean of a Canadian university, used to say that when we start our meetings like this and we talk about Indigenous issues, we always talk about the rosary of our grievances. All of the problems that we have in our communities. So we talk about the high rates of suicide. We talk about the high rates of poverty. We talk about our overrepresentation in the justice system and the child welfare system. In fact, everything that we really should be scoring well in, we're not, and everything we should be scoring poorly in, we are. And that is the rosary of our grievances. So, although we have rights, Indigenous children have rights, how are those rights expressed if all of these grievances persist? And when we look at Aboriginal children and their overrepresentation in the child welfare system here in this province and other provinces, how can we be assured that those rights are being supported and upheld? So within this system then, we have the system of the child welfare system operated by provinces to address some of the grievous harms coming to children, to make things better. And to balance that system then, we have the media who shine a bright light on the good and the bad, the strengths and the weaknesses in those systems. And here in the province of British Columbia, the Office of the Child Advocate, someone who also makes sure that the stories of Indigenous children are never left off our agenda, and to bring the stories of individuals front and center. This is a uniquely Indigenous approach to advocacy. We are a people of stories. We need to tell a story. And Thomas King talks about how when we tell stories, it sometimes trivializes the information, but not so. If we take the time to create a story around a person or a problem or a case or a system in our culture, that means we think it's important. So how did this whole thing come about? If we have all of these problems with Indigenous children, in spite of the fact that those rights are existent, how does this all come about? Well, it came about as an offshoot and a reflection of years of colonization, of the creation of the colonial mind. Let me tell you what the colonial mind is. Years ago at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, we sent out application forms. We said to people, we'd like you to apply for our funding, and we want something that is uniquely yours as a community. Something that you in your First Nation or your Métis community or your Inuit hamlet can say, this is something that we do for ourselves. This is unique. Because as an Aboriginal Healing Foundation, we didn't want cookie cutters. We wanted something that every person could create that would express their own culture. So we were asked by more than one group. They say, is it okay if we use elders, our elders, in these projects? We said, of course it's fine. And they say, do you have a list of approved elders that we may use? We were astonished. Can you imagine in your own community, in your own church, in the ways that you worship, in your own spiritual context, asking if your priest was okay, if your rabbi was okay? And this is the making of the colonial mind. After years of being subjected to doing it someone else's way, even when we came along, we could not engender people doing it their way. It was remarkable. It was a remarkable eye-opener for us. This really is a sense then, it's a learned helplessness. The idea that the community has a great barrier to overcome, a great deal of difficulty in learning to trust its own instincts, trust its own culture. So often, we look at the Indigenous community as an array of dysfunction. And good news stories about our community are sometimes hard to find. And it often reminds me of a model that Grant and I and Dr. Charles and others developed years ago when we talked about residential schools and the impact that that school might have on contemporary society. One of the questions I'm most commonly asked about when I speak publicly about Indigenous issues is, why do you people talk about the past so much if we should be concerned about where we're going in our future? It's because we have so much to learn from our history, and the legacy of those traumas still live with us. So in the model that we developed the impact of residential schools from the first contact between a child and an adult. And at the center of, if you think about it, dropping a pebble in a pond, and you think of all the circles that radiate out from that. In the center of that, in the center where the pebble drops, is a child and the abuse suffered in residential schools at the hands of an adult. Cultural abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. And then the next circle is a circle that we don't often talk about. And that is the circle of one child in residential school abusing another. And we have a strong belief that in many cases, a great deal of the abuse that occurred in the school occurred between students. And why is this? Because it's a learned behavior. Because a child, a mutual friend of ours, he told us that at this particular meeting that he went in as a 7-year-old and was very quickly abused sexually by a 12-year-old. And he said many of the 12-year-olds, when he arrived at the age of 12, felt entitled to abuse the children that were younger. And a cycle begins, a cycle that's engendered by violence and the lack of respect for the person and the abuse of those rights. So then, what's the next circle? The next circle is when that person leaves residential school and goes back to their home community and starts a family. And we think about the abuse that begins to occur in those families. Domestic violence, incest. And then the next circle becomes the violence between that family and another family in the community, another clan perhaps, or just another family with which we're at war. And so often, those of us who work in the Indigenous community call this lateral violence, the violence that occurs within our communities as we take each other on and take each other down. And so with all of this dysfunction in our communities, how does this manifest itself? What's the outcome of this? The outcome is as if we're standing on the very outside of the circle behind a pane of glass, and all we see are the outcomes, and those outcomes are high rates of suicide, family violence, violence between families, child welfare problems, parenting problems, neglect of children, and of course, a lot of this winds up in the justice system. And so the problem we have and you have, as observers here, is that you're standing in front of a pane of glass, and you're looking and you can't see anything but the dysfunction. And so infrequently, we get the chance to examine what happened in the middle, what happened in that first instance of violence, what happened when that child's human rights, that child was violated for the first time and then learned to violate other children. This is why we talk about history. This is why the history of 100 years of forced institutionalization, 100 years of residential schools is important to us. Perhaps this is our new rosary, the rosary that we say in public. So how do we change this? How do we change this? I mean, it's one thing to be identifying problems, but it's quite another thing to think about how it is that systems change, child welfare systems and justice systems and these sorts of things. Well, the first thing we talk about generally is the establishment of fairness. Now, I'm really reluctant to say the word funding, because most people, when they come before you and talk about problems in our system, they say, if only we had more money, things would be better. I'm not sure that's true. More money applied to dysfunctional systems might not get us anywhere. But I can say this, I support fairness. And the money that we spend on First Nations child welfare should be equal to the money that we spend in the rest of the population's child welfare systems. I think we can all stand for at least that type of fairness. So that's one way that we need to reestablish a balance in our system. The second one is control. And if you're following First Nations issues, control of our lives, control of our own agendas, control of our resources, control of our own treaties and those processes, all of those things, that control seems to matter a great deal to us. Seems to be very, very important. And I often tell people, if you're not sure how well you're doing in a First Nations community, if you leave the community after an intervention of some kind, and that community has more control over their own persons and their collective identities, their collective culture, than before you came in, then you've done a good job. Leave more control. Years ago, I remember working with the Department of Health in Ottawa, and we came up with this idea called transfer. So in other words, we would take all of the resources that a First Nations community used in their health and transfer that amount to them with an additional increment for administration. And that way we would transfer control of those resources to that community. Seemed like it made a lot of sense. And the way the picture was described to us was that the community would be brought in slowly to manage its own affairs, so that as a brick was removed, if you picture a bridge made of bricks, as each brick was removed on the government side, another one was put on the First Nation side. So slowly the First Nation would adopt control over its own health and health resources. But it didn't work that way. It was a check written, money went out, the transfer was accomplished, and in many cases, the community was not prepared to manage its own affairs. And so control is nothing without capacity. And so often in the systems that operate, child welfare systems, justice systems, we transfer control without transferring an investment in capacity and teaching people to use resources, and that's about the last place we should ever try to find economies. I want to talk to you, before I sit down, a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what I really like about it and what I think some of its limitations are, especially around this issue. One of the things that I really like about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is how it's galvanized all of us. So right now I don't have to go into a lengthy description of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is. Most people in this room know what it is, and that's remarkable. If I was here 20 years ago and talked to you about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, I bet I'd have to describe it to you. Even though the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was larger and much more research intensive and research based, and brought forward, I think, a more detailed plan. So the Truth and Reconciliation has done a wonderful job in capturing the hearts and minds of Canadians and drawing them to the issues, Indigenous issues. And I think that as a catalyst, it's done an excellent job. The other thing I think it's done is that as you read the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they often talk about systems and how we don't just tweak, we don't just add money, we reform systems. And I think that's healthy. But there's a couple of things that I really want to challenge in terms of those recommendations. Let me tell you a little story. Years ago, I was in Australia, And I was there for one day, not in Australia, in a particular city. It'd be a long way to go for one day. So, but I was in a city, and I was told to go there, and someone would meet me at the airport, and I could go, and there would be a speaking engagement. So I arrived at the airport, and a woman came toward me and said, "Hello, are you Mike Degani?" I said, "Yes." She says, "Great, I'm here to drive you." And I said, "You're not Australian. You have a Canadian accent." She says, "Yes, I'm from Canada. I'm recently immigrated to Australia." So that's great. So we drove around, and the speaking engagement was at some distance. And it became apparent after about 15 minutes that we were completely lost. And so I was asking her, "So is it around here somewhere?" She says, "I'm not quite sure." I said, why don't we pull over and maybe we can consult the map and take a look?" And she said, "You know, I've only just arrived here. I've only been in this city for a few days, and I really don't know my way around. And so why don't we work on this together? We'll get a map out of the glove box and we'll find our way." So there's a question here that I didn't ask immediately, but you know what the question is. And so as we unfolded this map on her hood, I said, "So how did it come to pass that you were asked to come to guide me to this meeting?" And she said, "Well, I don't really know how to get there, but we felt it was more important that you feel comfortable in the journey." And this is the problem with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. I am completely comfortable as an Indigenous person with these recommendations because I don't have to do anything. It turns out that in the reconciliation between you and I, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, that 93 out of the 94 recommendations require that you do something. And I don't think that's right. I'd like to feel a lot more uncomfortable reading these recommendations because reconciliation is going to require that I work and that you work, and that not that you come to stand by me, but that somehow I come to stand in the middle with you. And so I think too often with these recommendations, and this could be a reflection of the colonized mind, we are calling upon someone else to fix the problems in our community. That's a concern of mine. I think we know, in fact, what kind of progress we can make. I think we're well aware of the kind of progress we can make in terms of child welfare and the rights of children in this province, the Indigenous children in this province. But I think we understand how the elements of control, we understand elements of cultural sensitivity. We have all of this context. We understand the importance of oversight and all of these things. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission describes things as if things just started today. We have made great progress in the last 20 years. And when I read those recommendations and I don't see the work of the churches in the last 20 years, or the work of universities towards reconciliation in the last 20 years, or the work of governments and their systems in the last 20 years, we have much to do, but we have to start by acknowledging the good work of all of us and how much progress we have made. Another story. When I was small, I thought the best job in the world was to be a Catholic priest. I aspired to be a Catholic priest. There's all kinds of irony there, but we just don't have time to talk about it, okay? There's so many levels. So, at 10 years old, in my little Northern Ontario community, I had the opportunity to apply to be an altar boy, and I took the first possible opportunity. And I was granted a mass. At those times, there were all kinds of altar boys. People lined up to be altar boys. And I was granted a mass at 7:15 a.m. on a Monday. That was going to be my first mass. And I had gone to the training, and I knew where my cassock was and my surplice was. I looked like I was just right out of the Vienna Boys Choir. And I went to the church, early. My father drove me, 10 years old, and I had the opportunity to be a part of the Mass. And there was the priest, and there was me, and there was 3 elderly women in the entire congregation. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Monday. And so the priest said, Mike, would you like to help me by doing the readings? And there was a box that he had set up at a high podium with a book that big, and I read at the appropriate time the readings in front of this vast assembled crowd. And we went through the priest directed me through this, and at the end of it, as I was extinguishing the candles, these 3 elderly women came up to me, and from their little cloth change purses, they each gave me a nickel and said, what a wonderful young man, you did such a great job in presenting publicly. That was lovely. Well, I can't be stopped. I can't be stopped. From the age of 10, nickels, 15 cents is all it took for a lifetime of the enjoyment of speaking publicly. I would never turn down an opportunity. That's all it takes. That's all it takes, is the investment as children, a nickel, to create a wonderful lifetime of activities and desires and motivations. That's all it takes. And think about how we are missing that with our Indigenous children, so many of whom are in care, that it doesn't take tremendous amounts of effort on our part. It takes small individual actions, 1 nickel at a time, with the children that are there now, to produce tremendous benefits. As in my role with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, I have listened to hundreds and hundreds of stories of children told through the eyes and the voices of people who are 70 years old. All of these survivors of Indian residential school who tell me the stories of when they were children in residential school, and they tell it as if it was yesterday. And they remember every slight, every hit, every indignity, every trauma. They remember all of it, and they know how it's affected them today. And they also remember every act of kindness. The nun that lent them skates so they could learn. Right? The man who worked in the cafeteria who gave them an extra bit of food. They remember every bit of it. This is a wonderful way to pay tribute to courageous actions of the past. And we are called upon as a group to remember what has happened to our Indigenous community. And we have the opportunity to make our nickel investment today, individually, collectively, and to make things much better for Indigenous children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And again, we'll have a discussion period afterwards. I've always associated Mike with money because when I first met him, he funded a program I was running generously. And so he's really, really been one of my favorite people, although lately he hasn't given me any money. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, and I don't think I need to introduce her because so many of us know and respect her, but she is a most remarkable person. In my role in her office, I get to interact with her a lot. I rarely tell her how much I respect her because we argue a lot. And she's surprisingly kind in letting me be right most of the time. Anyhow, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, I think, sets a light for all of us in this province and in this country on what we have to be doing as citizens in terms of dealing with young people, in terms of dealing with families, in terms of being people who have the courage to take on systems that hurt other people, intentionally or not. So I'm really, really honored to be here and to introduce Mary Ellen.
thank you for that, Professor Charles. And first of all, I'd like to say good evening to everyone, and I'd like to thank Professor Archibald for the welcome and the acknowledgement of the nation, the unceded territory that we are meeting on, and the beautiful generosity as well of UBC, and thank Professor Archibald for her very inspirational work in terms of supporting Indigenous children in Canada to have better education outcomes and training generations now almost of teachers to support Aboriginal children. And I just can't help but stop and talk a bit about Professor Archibald, because when you work with issues with children, sometimes, you know, even though children's lives pass quickly, childhood is only 933 weeks, but when you work with issues with children and systems, whether that's education, child welfare, or health, there's some very prominent special health leaders here like Dr. Curran Worf and Dr. Christine Locke and others. Sometimes when you change those systems, it takes years to see progress. And if I think about Aboriginal or Indigenous children in British Columbia in the education system, someone like Professor Archibald and some of her key colleagues and associates really put in a decade of work before results improved, which is amazing. And in a way, I hope there's not too many young people here, because don't be discouraged by that. It goes by really fast. But then when you're over 50, you want all the time back. But it goes by quickly, but you have to really make that investment, and it takes time. It shouldn't take so long, but it takes time. But along that pathway, and shout out to Professor Archibald and to others at UBC who work to support Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous students, whether they're faculty, whether they're staff, or whether they just support that UBC become a place more alive and committed to better futures and collaboration with Indigenous children, youth, and families, and Indigenous communities. That's so important. I'm so honored to be here. First of all, I'm so honored to share the stage with a lot of people who've come up tonight who I really hold up and work closely with. But I'm especially honored that President de Gagne came from Northern Ontario to Vancouver to join me on the stage. I'm so delighted that Mr. Nussbaum and the foundation invited him to present, and I was allowed to co-present with him on Indigenous children. I have high regard for Mike and his work, especially his path-breaking work at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And what that work did was fund often projects that people thought, and I remember being out there encouraging and supporting projects and supporting people and his staff and his board. People thought the projects were completely kooky and crazy. People would constantly, and I was a lawyer and a judge at the time, they'd say, the government's funding a project where people are going to tell their stories. Like, what a nonsense project. We should have a bigger jail, or we should have more police officers, or we should have, what have you, whatever priorities of the moment. But actually, that Aboriginal Healing Foundation really laid the groundwork for thinking about healing and thinking about not only, like Mike talks about, telling stories, how important for Indigenous people it is for us to tell stories. And a lot of our stories, we have a lot of context, so we don't have to tell all the background to them. But in the Aboriginal healing world, stories are medicine. Stories contain a healing depending on how you tell the stories. And different storytellers have different status, not in a big hierarchical way, but some people can be people who can tell a story and create healing. There are people who can tell a story, they can create hurt. Sometimes there's like a trickster can do both. One day one and one day the next. They're a little unpredictable, and that's important because that's a full range of human experience. But stories, particularly the stories of grievances that Aboriginal adults have, and many of our parents and grandparents have, are stories that needed to be told and needed to be heard, and they needed to be listened to. And the Aboriginal Healing Foundation that Mike beautifully not only administered, but supported people and worked through so many complicated individual issues, gave resources. And money does matter. His nickels are important because it gave resources for people to actually validate that process of allowing individuals who have been through residential school, their personal experience and their collective experience, to be told and listened to in a very sincere way in which they were supported, but also could create that medicine toward healing. Because coming out to tell stories, the grandparents, people in the grandparents' generation, I'm very honored tonight among the many special people here. I can't recognize everybody, but there's a really special person here tonight with me who kind of didn't have a lot of choice, but she wanted to come, and that's my 13-year-old daughter, Portia LaFond. Hi, Portia. Can you stand up and say hi? Hi, Portia. She is going to kill me for that later. I just want you to know that. From a child development viewpoint, the worst thing you do to a 13-year-old, particularly your own child, is recognize her. But I love the fact that she's here, and I love the fact that she came with me because, of course, she shares her mom with this job that I have as representative for children and youth, working for all children in British Columbia. So sometimes I don't get to spend as much time with my own children that I'd like to, but also I really try to talk to her about the intergenerational issues, even in our own family, about residential school and how we address that, including how we address it today in the current, even in our own family, the current way in which our own family has to work through and our own community has to work through a lot of issues that need a lot of that medicine and a lot of that very healing perspective. And how can we come from that? And for Portia, her great-great-great-grandparents were student 001 and 002, the first two students at St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. They were the first two to walk through the door. So it's kind of important to think, well, boy, did they break trail? Well, they had a lot of stories to tell, and even now, you know, Portia, we don't share all of the stories of the family with the children because some of them are really too difficult, and children are not always ready to hear those stories. I'm not trying to be overprotective, but we need to think about children's well-being, that we tell those stories, even survivors that have a grievance and show they should have a grievance. They are entitled to be very aggrieved. But we have to think about how we tell the stories to children, when we tell stories to children, and how we can put those stories in a context. And that is actually why I was so excited to come tonight. And I was really excited to bring her because it really is about that personal issue for Indigenous children, for me, especially as an Aboriginal woman and as a representative for children and youth. And to be able to give a talk in honor of an individual, and this is where the connection for me is so powerful and strong, because the idea about loving a child, and like the message of the lecture series is how to love a child. What did Korjak represent about loving children in very difficult circumstances where it was extremely unpopular to love and support some children who were considered to be less worthy, who were considered to be actually disposable, and also to bring forward the idea that love is also a kind of medicine with respect to our society, and not only with respect to children, but with respect to our society. And we express our love for our own society and its furtherance by how we love our children, because we create a vision of something that we may not even be here to enjoy, that we create through that very values-based process. And even though people like me or Mike, we work in education systems, or Professor Archibald, we work in child welfare, we work in big bureaucratic systems. But we are not talking about creating perfect bureaucratic systems. In fact, Treblinka was about perfect bureaucratic systems. We're not talking about that when we talk about loving children. We are talking about values. And that's why I think I'm so excited to think about the courage and the vision of Korjak. Love is a medicine. It's a really powerful medicine that can help nurture and heal. And when you think about what love represents for children, and in the work that I do, and as an Indigenous person, when you come from a perspective of love, and I'm hardly a perfect person that has this figured out, trust me, it's a journey, and I'm sure Portia could come up here, she could give a talk that the Ministry for Children and Families might take to heart, but in any event, love is a medicine, and when you have that feeling of love and inspiration, like Mr. Korjak, Dr. Korjak represented in his practice as a pediatrician, in his work running the orphanage, in all the values in his writing, his foresighted writing of giving children dignity of being a human, fully formed human, capable of teaching, learning, experiencing life on equal status with anyone. That love concept that he had was really important. And what I take from it in my reading and my experience of his work and my knowledge of him, which thanks to Jerry and others, I've had a lot of time to reflect on because I've also sponsored as much as I can these discussions as one person. When I think about what does that love represent, where it comes for me with Indigenous children is it represents an approach. Loving Indigenous children has to represent an approach inspired by people like this. And that approach is not to come from a perspective of shaming, and not to come from a perspective of blaming, and not to come from a perspective of contempt, and not to come from a perspective of judgment. And I say that about Indigenous children because when you work with Indigenous children and their families, including your own family, there's a lot of shaming and blaming. There's a lot of judgment. And the intergenerational legacy of residential school is that somehow, well, first of all, anybody even knows what the experience is. We need to have reconciliation to understand that. Don't assume you know what it is. And number two, there's a lot of blaming and shaming. Shame was a key part of what allowed the residential school experience to be kept quiet and silence. It was the opposite of love, shame. And Korjak is really coming from that perspective of love is not about shame. Love is not about blame. We can't say those children in the orphanage needed to be sent to Treblinka because they had it coming to them. We're going to blame them? Are we going to shame their families because they didn't have families, they were orphans? Will we judge them as less worthy because they didn't have a type of citizenship that was valued in the Third Reich or in the Warsaw Ghetto? Of course not. So what Korjak represents to me is that love is a kind of medicine that you have to become attuned to with children and Indigenous children so that you remove yourself from the concept of shaming and blaming and judging. And that includes a real serious problem that we continue to have for current generations, the current generation of Indigenous children, which is we kind of want to save them, but we still want to blame their parents. And that's a very unhealthy attitude, very unhealthy, which means, oh, your mother's a drunk, but we're going to save you. Well, actually, your mother's not a drunk. We're not coming from a perspective of shaming and blaming and judgment. We're going to come from a perspective of love and understanding and context and seeing things like not only just residential school, but how other things can just devastate, multiple shocks that can devastate families. Not every family, but some families. So love is a medicine. And I think it's the medicine that actually builds reconciliation. So with Korjak, I love his work. It encourages me to think about him and think about his ideas. And it compels me to be courageous, but also compels me to have an openness about how I am going to work with children, youth, and other people to be able to talk about very difficult subjects that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Like when we talk with Indigenous children about their situation, you got to talk to them about the fact that they're probably pretty unhappy about some of the things that they are experiencing, and it needs to come forward and it needs to be addressed. So one of my big messages is that love is this medicine that we need to become very attuned to from Korjak. A second thing I really take from him that I wanted to share with you when I reflect about Indigenous children and rights, and more broadly, is that, and Mike framed this so beautifully, and I think we're such like minds about this, is that these stories are also our medicine. And, you know, he talked about Thomas King and Thomas King's Massey lectures. If you haven't read them, you should read them. They're funny, they're cutting, they're upsetting. If, you know, I'm sure Thomas King's kids are embarrassed to all hell by him. But they're great stories because, you know, it's celebrating one story that's repeated again and again with a minor change. And the same story every chapter and every lecture started out with the same story. And then it had a slight change. And then it goes deeper into some part of his own experience with his family. His mom raised him as a single mom, Thomas King's mom, or else something about his own career or his reflections or his development or his promoting a different understanding of the world of Indigenous people. And surfacing how Indigenous people do have these stories and they have different roles to play. but most importantly, surfacing a very strong Indigenous imperative and value that has been strongly represented, and I think it's very redolent of Korczak, and that is the idea that nobody owns your story, that you have to have the courage to say it. And you can't, when you say it, people will relate to it. They may find amusement in it. They might find inspiration in it. They may find commonality in that story. But the story and telling it, the courage to do that, to talk about the difficult thing, is a very important instinct related to love. And if you can't bring that out, and you don't have enough people in your society who are courageous, then your society is kind of doomed. And how do you build courageous people? Well, building is probably a crude explanation because we know it's about love and acceptance and space, but it's also about having very strong adults to allow people like kids to tell stories who can be courageous. And it also requires a function. Storytelling and understanding stories with young people means they have to respect that they have a right to be heard. And in fact, there is a right to participate in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Dr. Korczak represented that right to be heard. He wanted children to be heard. He wanted them to be seen in their best clothing. He wanted them to be heard. And when you think about it, he even went a step further against all mores in the society of the day. He wanted no corporal punishment of children, no physical aggression to children. Because physical aggression was a kind of subhuman, kind of anti-love behavior. He wanted none of that. And in fact, when you think about courage, to be able to talk about that meant that Dr. Korczak had to have the courage to talk about how violence against children, not only was it wrong to send the kids to Treblinka, where they were never heard from again, and the unspeakable happened to them and many others, but actually it was unconscionable to raise a hand against a child at any time. And so today, when we think about this for Indigenous children, well, residential schools were run on harsh physical discipline and punishment. Generations of parents were deprived of a family concept in communities because they weren't able to live in their communities with their grandparents and families. They experienced harsh physical discipline and punishment. Many Indigenous families struggle today, and I'm not saying this in any negative judgment way. I'm talking about from a very strong way because it's very fixable. From not having experienced unconditional love in a family concept with the safety of their culture and language, to having had this brutal treatment of violence. And yes, there was sexual abuse. Yes, there was what might even be a genocide or an ethnocide, intentional removal of children from their culture. This is something the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has put out there and hasn't answered. It remains there. It's a very serious human rights issue. But nevertheless, we have to come back to that. What did they miss? Children were raised in an environment deprived of the type of unconditional love, culture, language, and the right to know who they were and where they were. No, was it completely removed? No. Were some people more heavily affected than by others? Yes. Have stories helped rebuild this? Absolutely. In fact, stories were always told, sometimes well under the influence of intoxicants and not told very well, but there were a few courageous people who were prepared to talk about this. And that's why I shout out to people like Mike and others. Phil Fontaine, former chief of the Assembly of First Nations, took a lot of personal risks by talking about this, took a lot of ridicule. And as one person who's worked in Indigenous rights for many years, I've been in the journey from where I remember the ridicule, even in my own family, with an uncle who used to ridicule people who talked about residential school. He now is in charge of the Survivors Organization. He's come a long way. And it's a good thing. I'm not saying, oh, isn't he a hypocrite? I'm saying it's great because it makes a point that I think is so important about if you love people and you're prepared to understand that grievance and suffering is not permanent. It can be redressed. And how do you redress it? One of the things about children, and Dr. Korczak is an inspiration here, Many of you may be familiar with the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Andrew Solomon, who wrote Far from the Tree, about his experience. He talks extensively in that book, which is very interesting, somewhat disputed, but very interesting, about how it is so important for adults that love children to see something in children that maybe they don't even see, because they may be so mired in a context of rejection that there has to be healthy, positive adults that can see their potential and support them to get to their potential. That's a very important concept, because not surprisingly, guess what? Some of the children who have been most abused and maltreated can be the most challenging to engage with in terms of their emotional regulation, in terms of their contact with adults, in terms of their anger. They can be so challenged, and they can be so challenging. And I see this a lot in my work. People be like, they're service resistant. That's the government label. They're service resistant, but not that we've ever tried to serve anybody. I mean, this is not Walmart or McDonald's here. This is, we will leave you on your own because you're too angry for me to even listen to your story. But actually, if you take a page from Andrew Solomon and Yanis Korczak, what would you say? I actually am able to rise above it and listen to this story. And if I'm a good, healthy adult that's coming from a place of love, I can probably see what's in this story and see how it can be a medicine for the future. And so what is that core concept of medicine? And I want to give you my third thing that I really take from Korczak and my experience as an Indigenous person and as an advocate for children. And that is that rights are an important medicine. Why are rights so important? And Korczak knew this, that rights were important. Because rights are a way to reframe incredible vulnerability and systemic disempowering. Really, that whole piece where you can decide you loathe certain people. People are lower status for whatever reason. Rights are a way to reframe vulnerability into a different context that overnight takes, for instance, that residential school experience, and everybody's like, aha, like that's completely unacceptable. Who would ever do that to children? Because they have a right to learn. They have a right to be safe. They have a right to be heard. They have a right to have their language culture transmitted from their parents to them. And there's actually nothing threatening or harmful about that. And we're kind of sorry about using that as a device now. Because guess what? We can reframe it in the context of rights. And for children and youth, rights are really significant. I cannot say enough. It's a part of a bigger project. And rights respecting approaches to dealing with children and their voice means they're respecting their human dignity as equals, creating space for them to be heard. Even if you don't want to hear what they want to tell you, you're going to have to listen to learn to hear what they tell you. It's so basic and it's challenging, but it's about that reciprocity. And rights also bring us to something so important that Korczak recognized. And I think this is one of the great lessons he brought, which is social cohesion and living together in a healthy society requires that there be no one that is outside the paradigm of having rights and having dignity, no matter of their ethnicity, no matter of their religion. Korczak himself, his own faith journey changed throughout his life. So what? He can pick what his faith is. Children have a right to choose their faith. No one will tell them what it is. But they get to be exposed to their language, their culture. They have a right to be raised by their own families. That's a value in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The rights reframe vulnerability, and rights are too a kind of medicine that we can give in a society to particularly to children and youth who have been very disempowered. But rights are just lip service if there aren't people that have a deeper understanding of the values that they represent. And rights are paper tigers, just pieces of paper, unless there are people who are courageous enough to defend them. and unless there are mechanisms to enforce them and compel them. The child that has a right to be heard that no one listens to and disappears without ever being heard never really had a right to be heard. That right had to be real. And I think that's a key piece about coming back to the point, which is about telling stories. For Indigenous children in our province, for instance, in British Columbia, we have a long way to go to support Indigenous children. There's no way around it. 60% plus of the children in care are Aboriginal children or Indigenous children. Some of the poorest services provided are given to Indigenous children or no service, and to their parents, who are primarily fed a response of shame, blame, and judgment. And we are definitely in a different period than we were even when I started out as an Indigenous person, leaving my home and going into school and doing things. We're in a better place. We're in a better story. But we are not in a place where Indigenous children can in any way be guaranteed equal opportunities with other children in British Columbia. By accident of birth, they're going to be born with significant disadvantages that will only be overcome based on what we decide to do. Whether we decide we're going to have an accountable system focused on healthy outcomes and empowering those children and their rights and enveloping in that type of medicine that Yanis Korczak so much represents to us, at least to me, or whether we'll just say, oh, that's the project of another generation. We recognize it and we move on. Or do we stop and do something about it? And what do we do about it? Well, rights is a very valuable place to start. And among the constellation of rights, I'll just end on this. One of the most important concepts in understanding human rights, quite apart from the individual worth and dignity of every person and every child, is the extent to which the concept of equality and equal worth and dignity really animates that discourse of rights. So there is no reason why a young person, an Aboriginal young person in child welfare system, should only have a 13% chance of graduating, when the non-Aboriginal child in the family in British Columbia has an 85% chance. It's not possible that they're defective in some blameworthy way. The problem is we really haven't tried to change it. And we've tried a little bit, but we haven't tried enough. And so the bravery that it's going to take, the courage that it's going to take to not just listen to the stories, help those stories be heard, and help those stories bring change, is going to take a lot of courage by a lot of people. I'm confident we're going to get there. The best way I'm confident we're going to get there, if we love and support children, our own children and all other children, to tell them, this is what you not just have our permission to do, this is what we want you to do this. We want you to tell your story. We want you to be heard. And should you be shut down, should you, by whatever fate, because your parent becomes incapacitated or whatever, have to go in the child welfare system, we expect you to be treated as well as you would be in any family. In fact, we expect you to be back in a family and to be loved and supported in that family. And we have the highest expectations because as adults, we will not allow children's rights to be ignored. So for Canada and for British Columbia, when I think about Korczak, and in conclusion, I would just come back to that issue about love. And if we truly take that inspiration of this phenomenal pediatrician, activist, things can change so quickly if you decide to be on that side of courage and defend it. But even though we had him, there were so many people on the other side that didn't stand up. They just went away. They didn't stand up. And I think that's the piece, is to really recognize that this is one of the challenges of our generation. Dr. Archibald and I were saying this earlier. Close the education gap within our generation is a call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's a very good one. It's going to take work. get those Aboriginal children out of child welfare, especially out of stranger foster care, back into kinship placement and custom adoption. That's not going to be easy, but it can be done. I assure you it can be done. Improve the health outcomes for Aboriginal children so they don't have dental caries. They aren't without proper care and support in an appropriate system. Can it happen? Of course it can. But someone's got to make it happen. Someone has to make it visible and accountable, and the only way that can happen is if you absolutely put those rights of those children at the forefront, you evaluate whether we're getting there, you monitor it, and you report, and you take it so seriously as a society. And I guess we should give a shout out to our Prime Minister, who made himself also the Minister of Youth, which is pretty great, that you take it so serious that the highest office in any government, in any organization, will have a program for the rights of children and will engage with children. We're not there, but we could be there. And I give one other shout out to the new government in Ottawa that's made an intention. They made a commitment. I recognize this with Jerry because I was involved in this campaign with him for some time with very little success. We hope it truly happens. The federal government has announced that they will repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code so that you cannot use as a defense corrective discipline in using physical violence against children. There are prosecutions every year for people who use violence against children. And sometimes it's a parent. And I'm not coming from a position of I wanting people to be prosecuted. I don't want people to be prosecuted, but I want that out of the criminal code for the same reason Dr. Korczak advocated for it almost 100 years ago. Because no person should be the subject of violence. There shouldn't be anyone. For a period of time, it was okay to abuse women provided it only was a stick this thick. And then we got rid of that. It took a lot of fighting. There was a lot of stomping of the pretty little feet to get us there, trust me, and a lot of abuse that's not over. With children, a society that still has a provision in the criminal code that allows you to use physical violence, a society that had residential schools, organized violence, and oppression of children is not a society based on rights. Dr. Korczak's inspiration, I hope, will get us there. I recognize Jerry Nussbaum's advocacy, tireless advocacy, because I walked the same road with him, writing letters to every Minister of Justice, including every Minister of Justice in British Columbia that turned me down. And now we may get it done. And it took one, okay, maybe it's not just Prime Minister Trudeau, he came to office and said he was going to do it. Shout out to him. To have the courage to do it. Hopefully people will stand behind him because I'm sure there'll be critics. But of course, then we all are going to step back and ask just the same questions we all have to ask about Korczak. When he was sent to Treblinka with the children, what did everybody else do? Who stood up and why? And you always have to keep that in mind. Yes, there will be people that break trail, but when we advocate for the rights of children for years and years and years and get no progress, we're happy to get progress. But why was it so hard? Why couldn't people see that? So when that provision of the criminal code is repealed, and I'm sure you're going to hear criticisms in this province over it, because I'm sure there will be places where people don't support that, I hope you will celebrate in whichever way you can when that happens, because really the debt that we owe for that is to this person who most, school children like my daughter probably never heard of. Although now she does tonight, and I'm sure she's never going to forget it, and she's going to remember the night I embarrassed her, and that's why I embarrassed her. Because she's always going to remember that I embarrassed her. Because people never forget how you make them feel, even though they forget what you say. But then I have the opportunity to say, yes, but why? Because we have to remember where we get our medicine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. As you may or may not know, maybe many people do, Mary Ellen's term is up this November, and she'll be leaving her position. And I will do this, I'm sure, in other venues, but I just really want to honor her for the work she's done for all of us, and really hope that the next representative is half the caliber of her, because then we'll still have a great representative. Thank you, Mary Ellen. So we're going to ask for questions from the audience. Somebody will come around and have you write the question out, and then I'll read them, and we'll have speakers respond to them. They'll be sitting at the table that's at the front here. Here it comes. Yeah, I'll take all her questions. Mary Ellen once got stuck on the not been out across because of the fog from Victoria and asked me to speak on behalf of her at a conference. And all I could think of is I would be the last person in the world the audience would want to see other than Mary Ellen. And I won't tell you what the topic is, but even I was smart enough not to want to present on that. Yeah. We have questions? Graham, will you join us? So Dr. Archibald's going to be on the stage too, so questions for all three. So you come up, please. Test. Jim, do you have a question to start us off? Oh, sorry to put you on the spot, but Jim was on my supervisory committee when I did my PhD, and I've always looked for a chance to get back at him.
I really don't have a question, but I just want to thank the panel. All three of you had amazingly important things to say about how to love a child. I'm giving the closing talk in the one after next, and part of what I'm supposed to do is summarize some of the legacies that we hear about. I have more than enough to work with after tonight. So thank you for that inspiration. I'm almost speechless because there's so many thoughts going through my head. So thank you. And Michael, your stories, thank you. And Joanne, you've been an inspiration for many, many years. I don't have a question, except I guess it's how can I carry this forward, the challenges you've given us. I'm thinking about that. I don't have quick answers.
Thanks, Jim. Do we have any questions yet?
Your story's not right.
Sure. Yeah, it's got to be short, though.
Mary Ellen, you spoke a lot about systemic advocacy and the importance of having people that are there to enforce rights so that they're not just paper tigers. Can you talk a bit about the role that your office has in advocating for individuals within the province of BC?
Thank you. That was a question. I don't know if everybody heard that. It's a really appreciate that, Jeremy. It's an excellent question. It was about the role that an office like the Representative for Children and Youth office, the office that I hold. So what is the role of an advocate staff, for instance, in an office like ours, where we take a rights-based approach? And how important, I appreciate, it's a small office. It is an advocacy staff for the whole province of less than 20. And we've had, and Jeremy is actually one of our advocates, we've had more than 15,000 advocacy cases, which is pretty amazing. We're not the only people that do advocacy, but we do advocacy where we can know the actual information about what's really happening in the system. So we have privacy access, which is really key, because being able to know people's stories requires us to stand with them about that. So systemic advocacy and individual advocacy was Jeremy's question. It's really valuable. And that is, okay, if you have like 15,000 advocacy cases, it sounds good, but maybe you should only have had 5,000 because the same issues kept coming up again and again. And then you realize, well, we're not making enough systemic progress, especially when it comes to things like Indigenous children. And I really appreciate Jeremy's question because it's very true that in our office for Indigenous children, because they don't have strong enough protection for their rights, they frequently are having the same experience in multiple places without systems responding well. I'll just use a very simple example, like very basic things like not being able to get orthodontic care, pardon me. So they can't always get that. And the barriers are massive. So they have a right to health. They have a right to, they may be living on the parental home, state's their parent, but they can't get that support. So the systemic piece about understanding rights and advocating to make more known what the system is really key. So that's done by a couple of things. One, collaboration, people working together. Two, good quality evaluation and study of the system. Very careful, looking at why would there be a barrier and how does it function? And then thinking about how to improve it and thinking about that collaboratively. So advocacy is individual and systemic. And I think it's a reflection of a society if you can do systemic together. Very challenging in British Columbia and very challenging in Canada. I would say the barriers are so high at this point, but credit to people who can do it. And I just want to also note that advocates are not just in my office, they're community advocates, self-advocates. The right to be heard means anybody supporting people to be heard.
Okay, this is a question from a nursing student. What would you say the best, most important action for me and my classmates to take now and in the future? What's the most important action?
Well, I think for students in general, I think your first step is not to be too afraid of doing the wrong thing. I remember speaking to a faculty of social work several years ago, and the first question from the group, after describing the horrors of residential schools and the difficulty and that it's had for successive generations, it really made it sound as though there was that one action that you take today could have detrimental effects for generations. And so the first question the young lady asked was, what do I do? What if I do the wrong thing, right? I think in striving to do the right thing, I don't think we're going to go off the rails. And as students, I think you can be sometimes paralyzed with this notion that you don't know everything there is to know about Indigenous children. You don't know everything they need, and you're not perhaps as culturally aware as you'd like to be. But I think people see that beyond that to the kind of medicine that Mary Ellen talked about, you know, the love and the respect and the support. People see that, and so I'd say just don't be afraid, you know, don't be afraid to take that step.
Mike, I have a follow-up question for you in particular. And I'll read it to you. Dr. Degagne, I'm respectfully troubled by the reference to teaching Indigenous people to use resources, and that it sounds like perpetrating, imposing, patronizing inappropriate systems that may violate values. A response to that?
I think that's a good point. I think that when we do capacity building, there has to be some attention paid to values. I would never suggest that we teach in our efforts to train, to develop capacity, to support learning, that we don't do that in the context of how Aboriginal people would like to learn this information. So I have always been troubled by this. But we have to be able to learn from each other. Non-Indigenous people around us have a lot to give us. And I think we are not in a position to turn down the help of a caring society. So yes, people will make mistakes, or yes, they may come at this from a patronizing perspective, but I think it's important that we accept the help we're given. We do need help. There's no question about it. And, but I think that has to be done in a culturally sensitive way.
I've got a number of questions that are similar, but one of them is, what happens with children today that are being abused in similar ways to would have been the residential schools? What can you do about it? What do we do about it? Who can one talk to?
Well, I think take from what Mary Ellen said that, we need to be able to stand up when we see injustice or harm, especially that which is done to children. And I think certainly in schools there are various procedures in place and responsibilities that educators have, in relation to abuse that children experience. But I think it's that idea that we need to stand up. We need to be courageous. We also need to provide as much love to a child that may be experiencing abuse and other difficulties, because I think they can feel so alone. And I think in education, we often talk to our students to say, it only takes one person to make a difference in a child's life, one person to give a smile, to get to know somebody, to know that somebody cares about them in school. So I think that's important, that wherever we are, we can say, how can we ensure that a child feels that somebody cares for them, and it only takes a smile, a word, listen to their stories, and our elders tell us we need to listen with our 3 ears. Well, of course, 2 that we hear with, but the one in our heart. So we bring that, those together when we are listening, especially to children.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to confess a problem I have here with my own healing journey, and that is, if I think there's abuse of children, I think we should stop it immediately. So I agree with everybody, but I also think it's not just an academic issue. It's about having champions. Creating safety for children means allowing them to bring it forward to any adult and also responding to it. So if you understand child abuse and maltreatment, and of course as Indigenous people, we've had a very difficult experience with the residential school process, which is really coming forward slowly. We need to take that as a message that you have to stop abuse. So if someone discloses there's abuse, it needs to be reported and it needs to be disrupted. I'm not saying the child should be removed from the family if it's a familial form of violence, but there has to be a proper intervention to stop abuse. And neglect is complex, but physical and sexual abuse is very significant. And we know one thing quite well from research and experience. It's very hard to create good conditions, and it takes a lot of work for people to disclose sexual abuse. And when there's intergenerational sexual abuse, which we know there is, we do not now have a good system for disclosing. And I'm not saying all children should be removed and people should be in jail. That's not my position. But my position is abuse should be addressed. So creating a conversation of safety means really making kids feel safe, that they can disclose and that the adults will act appropriately to protect them, to discontinue sexual abuse and support them, for instance, and to recover. So I'm a little bit of a girl with a dragon tattoo when it comes to this, which is I think you actually have to do something now. So if I had my druthers, I would be actively involved, which I am, but I'd have a lot more people actively involved dealing with intergenerational sexual abuse across the board, but especially that Indigenous children experience. It needs to come forward, and the reconciliation moment inside families needs to have that experience where I'm not only saying grandpa, but grandpa owns it, if it was grandpa. And that there is a process to do it that honors the rights of the child. So I just make that point to say abuse is really significant. And I think one of the things Korjak represents is standing up for children and doing something. And like, he didn't leave the kids, he went with the kids. So if someone's disclosing that they're abused, we know where we need to be standing. And we need to make sure we have good systems that are Indigenous value-based systems. And I think they are there. So I think I'm a bit of a mother bear on this one, because I deal with so many kids that have been abused and who actually say to me, nobody believes me. You know, in fact, I've been in communities where people are like, I have a child, that's my dad's child, and they don't do anything about it. You know, I mean, and I'm not saying those are extreme cases, they're hard cases. So changing that means believing, listening, and creating systems of safety. And when we talk about the abuse that, you know, women and adults have, a lot of the pathways started out here. Somebody didn't believe them and didn't intervene. I believe we have the capacity to intervene positively and without judgment and blame, but we have to have accountability and we have to stop abuse. It can end, and it does exist.
So can you keep the mic for a second? How does children's right, in particular Aboriginal children's right, work within the Ministry of Children and Family Development model of social work?
Well, in the Ministry for Children and Family Development, I want the ministry to be successful, but it has a lot of work to do that it's not doing. And on Aboriginal or Indigenous children, the biggest issue, I guess I'll talk about the easiest issue. It's pretty much not working. And one of the reasons it's not working is because 60% of the children in care are Aboriginal children. Children who have among, not the only crises, but the major systemic intergenerational issues of abuse are Aboriginal children in British Columbia. The Ministry for Children and Families has 4,000 employees and less than 2% are Aboriginal. So you need a critical mass. We need at least 30% of that workforce to be Aboriginal and to have values. Yes, everybody should be trained, but there's conversations I can have here that I can see Mike and talk to Mike, and we don't have to footnote every experience. We have a lot of common experience. We're not brothers and sisters, but we have a lot of shared experience. In Indigenous child welfare, we need Indigenous people in that system in mass, and it's disgusting that we only have such low representation. Why? We have no targets, we have no recruitment, schools of social work are not doing enough, and there's lots to be said about that fact. But until you get a critical mass, we will not have understanding. And it's not just that, until we get values. Reconciliation in families means kinship placement, not stranger foster care. There's no structure for kinship placement and custom adoption according to tribal ways of doing things, meaning, yes, I adopt you, but your mother's not dead. She's right over there. She's just severely addicted at the moment, so we have to have healthy boundaries for you, but she's always going to be your mother. And you are going to learn how to deal with people who are addicted and in intergenerational crisis, because if you don't, you won't live in this community. And you can learn how to deal with it in a really healthy and positive way, because we know how to do it, because we've been doing it for years. And we're survivors, and we're great. We're going to be fine. We're resilient. We understand resilience. So resilience-based positive approaches to support kids, and not say we're going to take you out of that culture and put you in another one and rescue you. These are issues. So MCFD, I have respect for them. I oversee them. I have a lot of support for them to do things. But it's like they're from Mars and I'm from Venus sometimes. Like, I'm not even speaking the same language. And in fact, they don't even admit that there's a child welfare crisis for Aboriginal children. So half of my time is screaming in a snowstorm at them. It's the Aboriginal children that we need to support, okay? Can we do that? Can we stop forgetting that? Can we spend some money to do good things and get people? So, you know, that can be changed. So I'm not trying to slag them entirely. There's lots of people, and I support good teams. I support good people that do good things. We have the Vancouver Foundation here, Mark Gifford, for instance, who's been doing a process on fostering change with Aboriginal children, and the Vancouver Foundation has been doing incredible work supporting immigrant refugee children and Aboriginal children, and they've had some great people. It's not an Aboriginal organization, but they have Aboriginal youth advising them, and they're really working with young people, and that's the message, and MCFD needs to get that message. The perspective that I come from is, as I said earlier, I think we need to address the issues immediately about where children are living. When children go into foster care in particular, my view is children have a right to be in the family, and they need to be in a family setting. And we have the duty to protect children if there's abuse. If there's abuse, I'm not talking about your case. We also have the duty to support families, and Aboriginal and Indigenous families have had issues that are known without support. And my office has done a lot of work with families and communities where we've had to have some really difficult conversations about things. that people felt like they were really left alone and they weren't supported, and it was really hard. Well, I think the thing is that
Who do you report them to? I report them to the ministry's,
complaints process, yeah.
Yeah, the ministry's complaint.
Well, we'll talk a little, if you're okay, we'll talk a little bit after, because I know we have more questions, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that. Yeah.
So,
What to do in these situations?
They,
Do we all know who to go to? Or
I think if we had an easy card that could tell us how to do it, we would be at the point that we want to be at, which was we'd be at the point of being able to make it an easier issue to fix. But one of the challenges we are right now is it's kind of like the beginning of a conversation, and it's such a painful, difficult one, because we're talking about things happen to grandparents, great-grandparents. We're talking about things that are happening today. We were talking about things we don't want to happen to children. So we're not 100% got the answers, but we've got to find the way to get them.
sorry, but there are a number of other questions, and we're only going to get to one or two of them. But one is, if 93 of the 94 recommendations are what non-Aboriginal people should do, who's organizing us? How do we organize ourselves to respond?
I think it's a lot of the recommendations are directed to, universities, justice systems, child welfare. Each one of those areas and associations seems to be taking up their number. So I have bumped into people who have said, yeah, well, I think that recommendation 57 is something that I'm going to take to heart, and that my organization is going to work towards achieving. So I think in that way, perhaps a long list of recommendations has been helpful. My only concern originally was that it seemed that if we're going to be a partner in this, that has to be expressed.
Okay. Next question is, will there ever be justice for Aboriginal children on stolen native land?
Yeah, that's, I think we have to deal with the stolen native land, and it wouldn't seem that that's possible. At the same time, I think we go back to some of those traditional teachings and philosophies and relationships that actually come from that land, and somehow if we have a relationship with if we're fortunate to have our home territory or other land, and in some way we learn to nurture and learn from the land, and then maybe then too we stand up to the injustice of land that was taken away and those impacts of colonization, and say, how do we have a sense of reconciliation and work towards justice in relation to land?
We just have to wrap up in a moment. One of the things I think that is so critical about what we heard about tonight is the responsibility we all have to try to create change. And I don't mean change like this. I mean that change now with each other in the moment, the small change that creates massive change over time. We're in new territory here. I don't think there's ever been this kind of process before anywhere in the world at the scale of attempting reconciliation when we haven't even defined what that means. But part of it, and we've seen some really good lessons through some of the elders, for example, Garnet with the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, really good examples of small gestures towards other people as humans that create really significant change over time. So that's my takeaway here is children's rights are so important for creating change, but so are the rights of the rest of us as we interact. It's really about being human to each other. We have systems that have very major difficulties, and many of us work in those systems, and most of us don't feel like it's us, it's the system that's the problem. But we do have to look at ourselves, not in a way that makes us ashamed, but in a way that says, what am I doing, even in small ways that contribute to the problems we're having, and what can I do to change that? And I think if we have a lot of those, and we honor Korshak legacy, but we also honor the words that we've heard tonight on the stage. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here and for your presentations.